The man woke up to another quiet morning, the kind he had grown used to after years of service. His alarm clock barely made a sound, just a soft chime that echoed through the room. The sun had already begun its climb into the sky, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors of his small yet comfortable home. There were no loud noises here, no constant drills or orders. This was civilian life, something he hadn't imagined he'd find so peaceful. He stretched, letting his body wake up slowly. His muscles, once so sharp and responsive, felt the ache of age, but it wasn't the kind of pain that came from wounds or battle. It was just the wear of time. His life was quieter now. It had to be. The days of being part of an elite unit constantly on the move were behind him. Now, his biggest challenge was making it through each day without feeling the weight of everything he had left behind. His dog, a German shepherd named Shadow, was already awake and at his side, tail wagging as she jumped up to greet him. She was his constant companion, his one connection to the world he'd left behind. The bond they shared went beyond the typical relationship between a man and his dog. Shadow had been with him through some of the darkest moments of his life. When the missions were over, when the world seemed too loud and chaotic, it was just the two of them, in the quiet of their home, finding solace in each other's company. After a brief moment, the man went through his morning routine. He had learned to appreciate the small things, like the simplicity of a cup of coffee or the sound of the birds outside as he sat on his porch. For someone who had spent years in high-stress environments, this new life, though far from perfect, was peaceful. Shadow was always there with him. Whether it was sitting quietly by his feet as he drank his coffee or walking alongside him when he ventured outside, she was more than just a pet. She was his anchor, the one who kept him grounded in a world that often felt disconnected from the chaos he once knew. On this particular morning, he decided to take Shadow for a walk in the neighborhood. It was something they did every day. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. The man enjoyed the solitude. People rarely bothered him. He wasn't the kind of person who attracted attention. He had grown accustomed to the privacy his life now offered. But even in this peace, there was always a lingering feeling, one that he couldn't fully shake off, that something could disrupt it all at any moment. They walked for a while, past the houses with manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges. Everything was as it should be. The man didn't have to worry about people approaching him, or being asked questions about his past. He could walk these streets, blend in, and be left alone. It was a far cry from the life he had known, but he had learned to accept it. As they turned the corner, the man noticed a few police cars parked near the end of the block. It wasn't unusual for the local police to patrol the area. The neighborhood was considered safe, but it was still a place where they kept an eye on things. He didn't think much of it. Police were just doing their job, after all. The dogs were always barking when they patrolled, and he could see a few of them at the far end of the block, keeping a steady watch. But it wasn't the police officers that caught his attention. It was the fact that Shadow seemed unusually alert. She wasn't barking, but there was something about her posture, the way her ears were perked up, that made him pause for a moment. He stopped walking and looked down at her. She was tense, staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on something down the street. "Easy, girl," he murmured, trying to calm her. Shadow wasn't easily spooked. She had been trained for many situations and her instincts were sharp, but today something felt different. He could sense her unease, the way her body was coiled, ready to react at any moment. As they approached the intersection, the man saw a police officer standing near one of the parked cars. The officer was talking to a couple of people, but his attention seemed to be drawn elsewhere. The man couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. Something wasn't right. He couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Stay close, Shadow," he whispered, as if trying to reassure himself as much as the dog. He had been in enough high-stakes situations to recognize when something was off, even in the quietest of moments. It was then that the officer noticed him and Shadow. The officer's expression seemed to change instantly, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the dog. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement. The man didn't know if it was the way Shadow stood at attention, or the fact that the officer was just on edge. But the tension escalated quickly. Before the man could react, the officer took a step back, reaching for his gun. The man's heart raced, his instincts kicking in. He knew what was happening. Shadow, alert as ever, had reacted to the officer's sudden movement, but she wasn't attacking. She was just watching. It was the officer who seemed to misinterpret her stance, thinking she was a threat. The man opened his mouth to speak, to calm the situation before it spiraled further, but it was too late. The officer, clearly not trained to handle a situation like this, drew his weapon in a panic. "Back off," he shouted, his voice shaky. "Stay back!" The man froze. He could feel the weight of the situation unfolding before him. Shadow, his loyal companion, was being treated like a threat. He had been in countless life-or-death situations, but this one was different. He was no longer a soldier in the field, and this was no combat zone. It was his neighborhood, his life, his dog, and yet here he was, helpless as the officer pointed his weapon toward Shadow. "Easy, girl," he tried to say again, but his voice wasn't enough. The officer's finger tightened on the trigger. In that moment, the man realized there was nothing he could do. Shadow's life was in danger, and the officer didn't even know who he was. They didn't know the history he carried with him, the years of service, the respect he had earned. Before he could react, the shot rang out. It was a sharp crack in the stillness, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Shadow yelped, a sound that tore through the man's heart. She collapsed to the ground, her body twitching as the life seemed to drain from her. The man rushed to her side, his hands shaking as he knelt beside his fallen friend. No, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on him, but all he could focus on was Shadow. She was struggling to breathe, her eyes looking up at him with confusion, pain, and a hint of betrayal. The officer, realizing the gravity of what he had done, was silent, unsure of what to do next. But the man didn't care. Nothing mattered anymore. Shadow, his loyal companion, was gone. The minutes after the shooting felt like hours. The man was still kneeling on the sidewalk, holding Shadow's lifeless body close to him. He couldn't understand what had just happened. He had always been cautious, calm in the face of danger, but this was different. This wasn't a mission or a combat zone. This was his home, his neighborhood, a place where he thought he was safe. But now it felt like everything had been taken from him in an instant. He didn't know how much time passed before the officer spoke again, his voice still shaky. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." The man didn't respond. The officer's words meant nothing now. The grief he felt was too intense, too raw. His mind was a blur, filled with confusion, rage, and a deep sense of betrayal. How could this have happened? Shadow had never hurt anyone. She had been a loyal companion, trained to be alert but never aggressive. She was a protector, not a threat, and yet in the officer's eyes she had been a danger. The officer took another cautious step forward, his voice now filled with remorse. "I'll call for help. We'll get her checked out, maybe we can save her." The man's eyes lifted slowly, meeting the officer's gaze. His mind fought to stay calm, to process the situation with logic. But nothing about this felt logical. The officer didn't even know who he was. He was just another face in the crowd, just another person living his life, trying to move on from the past. And now he had to deal with the aftermath of a decision made out of fear, a decision that had ended Shadow's life. "No," the man said, his voice low but firm. "It's too late." The officer stood there, unsure of how to proceed, his expression torn. He was clearly trying to do the right thing, but the damage had already been done. Shadow was gone, and there was no coming back from that. "Are you okay?" the officer asked, but the question felt hollow. How could anyone be okay after something like this? The man looked down at Shadow's body, her fur now stained with blood. The sight of it made his heart ache. He had never felt so powerless, so utterly helpless. He stood up slowly, his legs feeling weak beneath him. The officer backed away, sensing that the man needed space. The man didn't look at him. He didn't know how to react, how to deal with the overwhelming emotions flooding through him. Part of him wanted to lash out, to scream, to demand answers, but he knew that wouldn't bring Shadow back. Nothing would. Instead, he reached down and gently lifted her body into his arms. He held her close, feeling the weight of her against him. The walk that had started out so normal now felt like a distant memory. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe, and now he had failed. With Shadow in his arms, the man walked back toward his house. The officer didn't stop him, didn't try to say anything else. There was nothing left to say. The damage was done, and the man couldn't undo it. As he walked, the man's thoughts turned inward. He had been through so much in his life, so many missions, so many dangerous situations, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the loss of the one thing that had kept him grounded. Shadow had been there for him during the darkest times, offering comfort without asking for anything in return. She had been more than a dog. She had been his partner, his friend, his family, and now she was gone. When he reached his front door, he gently placed her on the ground, his hands trembling. He couldn't stand to look at her anymore. He needed to get away, to clear his head, but he didn't know where to go. He just stood there staring at the door, feeling completely empty inside. His mind raced. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't just let this be a mistake, a moment of fear that had taken something precious from him. He had seen things in his life, things that most people would never understand, but this was different. The officer didn't know who he was. He didn't know the years of training, the missions that had tested him, the sacrifices he had made. He was just another person, another civilian trying to live a quiet life. But the officer's actions had made it clear that the world wasn't as simple as he had hoped. He had lived through wars and dangers that most people could never imagine. But it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about justice. And Shadow's death wasn't just an accident. It was a failure to understand, a failure to recognize that some lives were more than what they appeared to be. The man took a deep breath and made a decision. He would not let this go. He didn't know how and he didn't know where to start, but he couldn't allow this to be swept under the rug. Shadow deserved justice. He walked into the house, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. As he sat down on the couch, he let out a long, shaky breath. The silence in the house was deafening. He could still feel the absence of Shadow beside him, could still see the imprint of her body on the floor where he had laid her down. There was so much he didn't understand. Why had the officer reacted that way? Why hadn't he taken the time to assess the situation? Was it just fear? Had Shadow's instincts, her protective nature, been misunderstood? The man couldn't shake the questions. But more than anything, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play here. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about something much deeper, something that had been festering for far too long. As the hours passed, the man found himself sitting in the dark, thinking about the events of the morning. He knew he had to do something, but what? What could he do? The officer was just doing his job, wasn't he? But the man couldn't let it go. He had spent years learning how to navigate dangerous situations, how to handle pressure, but this wasn't like anything he had ever encountered before. He was no longer in the military. He no longer had the authority to make decisions, to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't just go after the officer. That wasn't who he was anymore. But he also couldn't sit back and let this go. He needed answers. He needed justice. The man stood up abruptly, his fists clenched. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. He didn't know how he was going to get it, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Shadow's death be in vain. He was going to make sure that the officer understood what he had done, that the system understood that this kind of mistake couldn't be overlooked. The man knew this would be a long, difficult road. But for Shadow, he would walk it. The next few days were a blur. The man moved through them like someone who was stuck in a fog, unable to see clearly, but knowing he couldn't turn back. Shadow's death weighed on him heavily, but it wasn't just the pain of losing her that consumed him. It was the feeling of helplessness, the knowledge that the life of his beloved dog had been ended by a single mistake, a mistake made by someone who didn't even know who he was. He had made the decision to seek justice, but figuring out where to start felt like standing at the edge of a vast, empty field. The world he had left behind when he walked away from the military felt distant now, like a past life he had tried to bury. But there was no burying this. He couldn't let Shadow's death fade into the background. He had to do something about it, even if he didn't yet know what that something was. The first step was simple. He went to the police station. It wasn't far from his house, just a short drive away. But as he pulled into the parking lot, he felt a knot in his stomach. The place looked so ordinary, so unassuming. It seemed like the kind of place where nothing significant ever happened. But for him, it felt like the center of everything that had gone wrong. He parked his car and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The building loomed in front of him, and he knew what he had to do. He had to confront them. He had to make them understand the gravity of what had happened, to make them understand who he was, and why this situation couldn't just be brushed aside. Walking inside, he was greeted by the receptionist, a young woman who looked up from her desk with a polite smile. She asked how she could help, and he took a moment to steady himself before answering. "I need to speak to someone about an incident that happened a few days ago," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that he couldn't hide. The receptionist gave him a questioning look but quickly nodded and gestured for him to sit down. A few minutes later, a uniformed officer came out from the back and walked toward him. He was young, still in his early 20s, and looked like he had barely been through any real experience. The man stood up, his eyes narrowing slightly as the officer approached. "Can I help you, sir?" the officer asked, his tone respectful, though there was a slight wariness in his voice. "I'm here about the shooting that took place on my street," the man replied, "the one that killed my dog." The officer's expression shifted instantly, his eyes darting toward the receptionist, then back to the man. "Oh," he said, his voice faltering. "Yes, of course. That was a tragic situation. We've been following up on that." The man felt his anger begin to stir, but he kept his voice steady. "A tragic situation? You call that a tragic situation? My dog was shot because of a mistake, and no one seems to care about it." The officer looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I understand that it was a very unfortunate event. But the officer who was involved, he thought your dog was a threat. It wasn't intentional. He was just doing his job." The man clenched his jaw, fighting to stay composed. "I don't care if it was intentional or not. It shouldn't have happened. Shadow wasn't a threat. She was just walking with me like she always does. There was no reason for that officer to pull his gun." The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure how to respond. "We're still investigating what happened," he said finally. "But you have to understand that the officer was trained to respond to perceived threats. He acted based on his training." The man took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm rising inside him. "I've been through more danger than most people will ever see in their lives. I know what it's like to face real threats, and I know what it's like to make split-second decisions under pressure. But this wasn't a war zone. This was my street. My dog." The officer looked down, his face flushing with discomfort. I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly, "but it was an unfortunate misunderstanding. We're doing everything we can to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." The man knew that the apology meant little to him. Words weren't enough. Words would never bring Shadow back. He had seen enough in his life to understand that sometimes the only way to get through something like this was to hold the people responsible accountable. But accountability wasn't just about apologizing. It was about ensuring that the system worked for everyone, not just when it was convenient. "I don't want your apology," the man said, his voice cold. "I want justice, and I want to make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else. No one should have to go through what I've gone through." The officer seemed to realize that the conversation wasn't going in the direction he had hoped. He cleared his throat. "I understand. If you'd like, I can make sure your concerns are directed to the department's internal affairs. They can investigate further." The man nodded slowly. "I'll be doing that myself." With that, he turned and left the police station. The encounter had given him nothing he hadn't already known, that the system as it stood wasn't going to change unless someone forced it to. Shadow's death wasn't going to be swept under the rug, not if he had anything to say about it. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and meetings. The man contacted a lawyer, someone he knew who had experience with cases like his. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind, listened carefully to his story. She didn't offer empty promises, but she did offer him something he hadn't realized he needed, a sense of direction. She told him that there was a clear path forward, one that involved holding the officer accountable, but also making sure that the law enforcement agency itself was scrutinized. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake, it was about the system that allowed this kind of thing to happen. The man, despite the overwhelming grief that still gnawed at him, found a sense of purpose in those words. He wasn't just fighting for Shadow anymore. He was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting for every person who had ever lost something precious because of a system that didn't understand the value of life. He wasn't going to let Shadow's death be forgotten. He spent the next few weeks gathering evidence, speaking to neighbors, and working with his lawyer to build a case. He didn't know how long it would take or how difficult it would be, but he was determined. Shadow deserved more than just an apology. She deserved justice. The process was slow, frustratingly slow. He had moments when he felt like giving up, when the weight of the whole thing seemed too much to bear. But then he would think about Shadow, about the bond they had shared, and he knew that he couldn't quit. He couldn't let her down now. There were days when he still found himself sitting in the silence of his home, looking at the empty spaces where Shadow used to be. The grief would hit him like a wave, drowning him for a few moments before he could pull himself together again. But it wasn't just grief anymore. It was a sense of purpose. He had to see this through no matter how long it took. Shadow had given him years of companionship and loyalty. The least he could do was give her this. The days stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last. The man's determination had solidified into something stronger than just grief. It had become a quiet resolve, one that kept him moving forward even when he didn't know what the next step would be. The weight of Shadow's loss still pressed on his chest, but it was no longer all-consuming. The fight for justice had taken center stage in his mind, and every moment, every thought, was now focused on making sure that no one else would have to experience what he had. The legal battle was starting to gain some momentum, but it was slow. It always was. The man found himself sitting in lawyers' offices more often than he cared to, listening to discussions about internal investigations, policies, and procedures. It wasn't the world he had been trained for. He was used to action, to immediate results, to a life where things didn't drag on indefinitely. But this was different. The law moved at its own pace, and the man had to learn how to navigate it, step by careful step. His lawyer had been a steady presence throughout the process. She was direct, pragmatic, and unflinching in her commitment to the case. She explained the legal complexities with clarity and never sugarcoated the difficulty of the situation. The man appreciated that. He didn't want false hope. He just wanted a chance to make things right. The most difficult part was that the case was, in some ways, about more than just Shadow. It was about accountability, about making sure that law enforcement understood the consequences of their actions. The officer involved, despite his apology, still didn't understand the depth of the damage he had caused. And while the officer's mistake had been tragic, the system that allowed it to happen was something the man couldn't ignore. He had seen firsthand how easily fear and misunderstanding could spiral out of control. Shadow's death was a painful reminder that the system needed to be better, that training, protocols, and decision-making had to be more thoughtful, more nuanced. People's lives depended on it. As the case continued to unfold, the man found himself becoming more and more involved in the details. He read through reports, spoke with witnesses, and carefully reviewed every document related to the incident. The memories of that fateful day never fully left him. They were always there, hovering just beneath the surface. But now they were joined by something else, something that kept him from drowning in the sorrow. Shadow's death had started as a painful, senseless loss. But now it had become a cause. It had become the driving force behind everything he did. Every decision he made, every step he took, was now a reflection of the commitment he had made to her, to himself, and to the idea that this kind of tragedy could not go unnoticed. One afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table, reviewing some legal documents, he received an unexpected call. It was from the officer involved in the shooting. The man's first instinct was to ignore the call. He had no desire to speak with the officer. But then something inside him shifted. Maybe it was the need for closure. Maybe it was something else. But whatever it was, he decided to answer. "Hello?" he said, his voice calm but guarded. "Hi, is this the man who owns the dog?" The officer's voice sounded hesitant, as though he was unsure of how to continue. "It is," the man replied, his grip tightening on the phone. "What do you want?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The man could hear the officer shifting uncomfortably. I wanted to say that I'm sorry. I've been thinking about that day a lot. I never meant for it to happen. I didn't know who you were, and I panicked. I made a mistake, and I can't undo it, but I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry." The man closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. The apology felt empty, like a hollow gesture. He didn't want the officer's regret. What he wanted was accountability. What he wanted was for the officer to understand that his actions had consequences, that lives could be altered in an instant by a single decision made in fear. "I don't want your apology," the man said, his voice steady. "It doesn't change anything. My dog is gone. She's never coming back, and no amount of apologies will bring her back." The officer was silent for a moment, and the man could hear the guilt in his voice when he spoke again. I know it's not enough, but I don't know what else to say. I messed up." The man didn't respond at first. What could he say? The officer was already regretful, but it wasn't enough. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice firm. "It's not just about Shadow. It's about the system. The training, the protocols, the way you respond to situations like this. People's lives are on the line. I've spent my life in situations where I had to make decisions under pressure, and I know what it's like to feel fear. But I also know that the system has to be better. No one should have to go through what I've gone through." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The officer didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I understand. I never wanted to hurt anyone, and I'll do whatever I can to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." The man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in his chest. "I'll hold you to that. I'll hold the whole department to that." With that, he hung up the phone. He wasn't sure what to make of the conversation. The officer's apology had been sincere, but it had been too late. The damage had already been done. What mattered now was what happened next. Would the department take responsibility for the officer's actions? Would they make the necessary changes to prevent future tragedies like this? The man wasn't sure, but he wasn't going to let it go. He couldn't. The following weeks brought more challenges. The legal process was grinding forward, but at a pace that felt agonizingly slow. He spent countless hours meeting with his lawyer, preparing for the next steps. The man knew that the road ahead would be long. It wasn't just about seeking justice for Shadow. It was about fighting for a change in the system, about making sure that future generations of dogs and people wouldn't have to suffer the same fate. The day of the hearing finally arrived. The man walked into the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment he had been working toward for so long. The courtroom was filled with people, lawyers, officers, witnesses, and a few spectators who had heard about the case. The officer involved in the shooting was there too, sitting quietly in the back. The man didn't look at him. His eyes were focused on the judge, on the task ahead. As the proceedings began, the man felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had done everything he could. He had given everything for this moment, and now all he could do was wait and watch as the justice system took its course. In the end, the officer was held accountable. It wasn't a decision that would bring Shadow back, but it was a step in the right direction. The department promised to review its training protocols to ensure that officers were better equipped to handle situations involving animals. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As the hearing concluded, the man walked out of the courtroom with his head held high. He had done what he had set out to do. Shadow's death had not been in vain. The man had fought for her, for justice, and for the hope that something good could come from tragedy. The weeks following the hearing felt like a strange kind of quiet. The man didn't know how to feel. The case was over. The officer was held accountable, and the department had promised to make changes. But none of that had brought Shadow back. None of it could erase the empty space that she had left behind. He spent the days after the hearing walking through the motions of life, but nothing seemed the same. There were moments when he would forget, when the weight of the loss would lift just enough for him to feel like himself again. But then he'd catch sight of something. A familiar place, a spot where Shadow liked to sit, and the grief would come rushing back. It wasn't constant, but it was always there, waiting to remind him. Still, there was a sense of closure, a kind of peace that he hadn't known was possible. The case had been exhausting, emotionally and mentally draining, but he had fought for Shadow, and in the end he had succeeded. He had honored her memory by making sure that her death wasn't in vain, that the world had been forced to acknowledge the mistake that had been made. He had spoken out, and the system had listened, at least to some extent. But despite the legal victories and the changes that were promised, the man knew that he could never fully move on. Shadow's death had forever changed him. He would always carry that day with him. The way it had felt to hold her in his arms as she took her last breath. The way it had felt to lose something so precious in a moment of fear and misunderstanding. One morning, as he sat at his kitchen table, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It wasn't something that happened often, especially not so early in the day. He stood up and walked to the door, wondering who it could be. When he opened it, he found the officer standing there, his face downcast, his posture uncertain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The man could feel the officer's hesitation, the weight of the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. The officer shifted his weight, then finally spoke. I wanted to come by to say that I'm sorry again. I know it's been a while, but I've been thinking a lot about what happened. And I just wanted to make sure you knew how deeply I regret what I did. The man looked at him for a long moment, taking in the officer's words. The apology wasn't new. It wasn't the first time the officer had said he was sorry, but something about the way he spoke this time felt different. There was a sincerity in his voice that wasn't there before, a sense of understanding that hadn't been present when they first spoke. "Why are you here?" the man asked, his voice steady but cautious. He wasn't sure what the officer was looking for, what he expected to gain by showing up at his door after everything that had happened. The officer swallowed hard, his gaze falling to the ground for a moment before meeting the man's eyes again. "I don't know if this will make a difference, but I've been talking to people in the department. I've been looking into what happened that day, and I've been trying to understand why I reacted the way I did. It's been eating at me, and I wanted to say that I'm sorry, but also that I'm doing what I can to make sure it doesn't happen again." The man took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what he expected from this conversation, but this wasn't it. He had spent so much time fighting for justice, for accountability, that he wasn't sure if he could accept anything less than full responsibility. But he could see that the officer was trying in his own way to make amends. And maybe that was enough. "Do you understand what happened?" the man asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Do you understand why it happened?" The officer nodded slowly. "I think I do. I thought I was doing my job, that I was reacting to a threat. But I wasn't thinking. I didn't stop to assess the situation, to understand what was really happening. I just reacted out of fear, and that fear cost you something that I can never give back." The man didn't respond right away. He could feel the old pain creeping up in him, threatening to drown him in it again. But this time he held it at bay. He had already processed that pain, already accepted it as part of his life. The loss of Shadow would always be with him, but he didn't need the officer to carry that burden for him. The officer had apologized, and in his own way, he had tried to understand the gravity of his actions. That was something, at least. "I appreciate that you're trying," the man said finally. "But words can only do so much. The system needs to change. People need to be trained better, to make better decisions. The kind of fear that led to this shouldn't be in anyone's hands." The officer nodded again. "I understand. And I'm going to keep pushing for that change. For better training, for more awareness. I don't want anyone to go through what you've gone through. I won't let this happen again." For a moment, the two men just stood there in silence. The officer wasn't looking for forgiveness, and the man wasn't offering it. But there was something in the air between them, something that felt like a mutual understanding, a recognition of the gravity of what had happened. Finally, the officer turned to leave, his shoulders slumped slightly. Before he walked away, he looked back at the man. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me a chance to say this." The man didn't respond. He just watched as the officer walked down the driveway and disappeared down the street. The door closed softly behind him, and the man stood there for a moment, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know if this conversation had made a difference, but he did know one thing. It had given him a sense of peace he hadn't known he was missing. The case was over. The officer was being held accountable, and the department had promised to review its policies. It wasn't the outcome the man had imagined when he started this fight, but it was something. It was a start. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new routine. The man still missed Shadow every day, and there were moments when the grief would hit him like a wave, overwhelming him. But there was also a sense of healing, a sense that in some way he had done everything he could for her. As time passed, he found himself thinking about what had come out of this tragedy. He had fought not just for justice for Shadow, but for something bigger, for change, for a better understanding of how to handle situations like the one that had stolen her life. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And that progress, that sense of change, was something he could hold on to. For the first time in a long while, the man felt like he could breathe. The fight had taken its toll, but he had done what he needed to do. And now, Shadow's memory would live on, not just as a beloved pet, but as a catalyst for change. He knew it would take time, But maybe, just maybe, things would start to get better.